You've got the oil filter housing, and the oil filter sits snugly buried inside, and the problem is they often start to dissolving and they'll shear at the very bottom, so when you remove the canister and pull the filter out, you'll find them coming apart at the seams at the very base. But the coolant tank lids are also another common area where they've been known to leak. They don't seal properly and then they sometimes bubble over. The N54 and the N55 before it actually used a rubber valve cover gasket, and unfortunately with time it was a guaranteed leaker. Sadly enough, the B58 carries on the tradition with a rubberized valve cover gasket. Life's too short to drive boring cars. So what's common between this car, or this car, or even this car, for example? Well, what it actually is they all have the turbocharged 6-cylinder engine in a modern day BMW. And here we have the X7, it's the 40i series. It's actually outfitted with the B58 engine. That's right, it's the current generation inline 3-liter turbocharged 6-cylinder engine, of course. And with BMW's sordid history with reliability, one has to ask, many people say that this is currently a very reliable engine for BMW. But in fact, how reliable is it really? I want to share with you guys the key problems that you'll find with the B58 engine, and then you can, for yourself, make a decision whether it makes the grade. Let's get into it now. So BMW straight 6 engines have always been historically well known for the driving experience and a relative level of reliability, until they changed to turbocharging back in 2007. I personally owned a 335 with the new twin-turbo 6-cylinder engine called the N54, and it was a disaster from a reliability standpoint. Now, I actually bought the car because many people said, well, they're the greatest tuner cars. They have forged internals, and that's why a lot of tuners enjoy the N54. But I learned the hard way very, very soon due to coolant leaks, oil leaks, high-pressure fuel pump failures, injector issues, wastegate rattle. And as well, it pumped out so many check engine lights, the dashboard illuminated like the neighborhood in Candy Cane Lane. But then BMW quickly figured out there was lots of problems, extra turbo, extra moving parts, and they wanted to revise it and make it a little bit better. And then they started putting it in vehicles like this. It no longer had 2 turbos, it now had 1 turbo and was far more reliable. For example, right here you'll notice we have a 35i series in an X5, as we see right back here. Of course, these were a lot better than the initial twin-turbo straight-6 engine, but these also had their share of coolant leak issues, valve cover, oil pan gasket leaks, injector problems, and the like, although they were a lot better. But then BMW stepped up their game, created another engine that was more modular by very design, and it was also 3 liters by displacement, but it's grown vastly more reliable. And it's called a B58, like this. Right there, you'll notice you have a 40 series car, and this is the X7. It is an absolute behemoth of a vehicle, very large and in charge, but that 40 series does not just end and begin with the X7. You could also get the B58 in the X3 as the 40i series. You can get it in the X5, X6, X7. You could also get it in 3 series cars, 4 series cars, now the 2 series cars as well. 5 series and 7, you betcha, you can get them there as well. Very commonly used engine. And so it begs the question, are they actually reliable? Well, let's get into it, and I'll share with you 4 of the key ingredients that will define how reliable this vehicle is. Let's go. So the B58 started out with about 322 horsepower, later models scaled up to about 355, and of course they started around 2015 for the first generation. Then they had a more recent update to the overall engine design, and it's called the B58 TU1. Mostly for emissions, but there are actually some very notable improvements on that engine, which should hopefully help the newer generation of the B58 as well. So there's 2 sub-variants of the B58. There's the ML, which is sort of a mid-grade performance level, 335 horse. If you get the OL in recent variations, it can go up to a staggering 382 horsepower. Blistering by all means. And that would be you typically find in the later version of the M440i. So besides just the updates in power and performance, as well as emissions, there's lots of many other updates that actually likely will improve the overall durability and reliability for the long term. For example, the fuel system has been upgraded, better injectors, and typically that's going to help the longevity. If you're starving for fuel at high revs and high boost, that's where you're going to start to see problems. It also has particulate filter updates, and then of course the timing chain arrangement on the front of the engine. Timing chains have been a very controversial area, N63, the N20, and of course the B58, they take it to another level in terms of updating that, so hopefully adding a little touch of reliability. They've also created what they call split cooling design, hopefully to add a little durability there as well on the cooling system. Lord knows BMW has struggled with some of those issues in the past. And as well, the crankshaft's been updated as well with a little thickening and beefing up around the crankcase to hopefully reduce the amount of issue and movement within that. Unfortunately, there's been some reliability issues in small amount of numbers. So the first common issue with the B58 engine is potential coolant loss. Now they can come in many forms, some of which of course is just leaking. There's a primary and a secondary tank, and ultimately the primary tank handles the majority of the coolant. The secondary tank supports the air to water intercooler. Now everybody knows BMW often uses a lot of plastic parts, and it's not uncommon with a little bit of age that the deterioration starts cracking plastic parts and results in leaks. But it's not just about the leaks, because leaks can come from fittings, hoses, water pumps, thermostats, the two tanks, but as well it can actually consume antifreeze as well. So that's basically what you call natural coolant leaks. Of course, there's visible leaks that you'll obviously notice then when you see coolant on the ground like that. But the coolant tank lids are also another common area where they've been known to leak. They don't seal properly, and then they sometimes bubble over. There's also vent lines which could dissipate some coolant over a period of time with a lot of hot running. And of course, overheating in general. If you ever overheat one of these engines, you're in a lot of trouble. Aluminum heads, aluminum case means troubles because they can warp in very short order, and then you're up the creek. You could have compression leaks, you could have coolant leaks, and you're just in a world of hurt if you allow the vehicle to overheat. So if it ever starts running hot, turn it off. You're better doing that than actually let it get to that boiling point. So if you're finding you're consuming coolant, if you're having to add a significant amount, say every 5 or 10,000 kilometers, then you might actually start looking into the issues whether you have a problem. Now, I would basically start with checking the cap, possibly replace the cap, because sometimes that's just an easy fix. Other than that, you're going to have to take it to a mechanic, likely apply some pressure to the system and see if it holds it. So the second reliability issue that you'll typically find in a lot of B58s are valve cover gasket leaks, not uncommon for a lot of BMWs. Now, if history repeats itself, then you'll know the N54 and the N55 before it actually used a rubber valve cover gasket. And unfortunately, with time, it was a guaranteed leaker. Sadly enough, the B58 carries on the tradition with a rubberized valve cover gasket. And ultimately, you could expect to start seeing leaks anywhere from about 60,000 to about 110,000 miles. In that range is where you'll start seeing them pop up out of nowhere. Now, the added bonus with the B58 engine here is that it has what they call the heat encapsulation system, which actually maintains closer to normal core temperatures for as much as 36 hours. That's a really, really positive situation, considering especially a lot of climates like Canada and northern states where you get really hot engine temps and then you turn the car off and you could see minus 20, minus 30 degrees Celsius within about 3 or 4 hours. And next thing you know, it's those heat cycles that expand and contract. And it's the heating that starts to take a toll on the rubberized gasket. We also can't forget about the plastic valve covers themselves. They are known to warp and split and crack. And when that happens, it's a pretty sizable job to repair. Of course, that usually means a leaking of oil. You're going to smell it, you're going to see it, and it's going to be pretty obvious. You're going to get that burning smell that sort of wafts into the cabin, and it just smells like oil dripping on an exhaust manifold. That's what you'll smell. You can also see obvious signs of smoke, sometimes coming out from under the fender wells, maybe out from under the hood. That's not coolant related. It could actually be your oil from a valve cover gasket. When you're doing your tune-up and you're pulling spark plugs, you could also find excess amount of oil around a particular plug or two. That usually is a sure indication that you're getting oil down into the plug wells, and that 9 times out of 10 you're dealing with a valve cover gasket leak or a split cover. And of course, if you leave this long enough, you could actually have a low engine oil level pop up on the dashboard. So the third major problem that you can find in a modern B58 engine actually happens to do with disintegrated oil filters, which right in there, you've got the oil filter housing and the oil filter sits snugly buried inside. And the problem is they often start to dissolving and they'll shear at the very bottom. So when you remove the canister and pull the filter out, you'll find them coming apart at the seams at the very base. It often makes it very difficult to get the entire piece out. And if you're still under warranty, I would push the dealer even to replace the entire housing at that point. It's a tragic design, sure, but even more importantly, the bigger issue is the extended oil service intervals, in my opinion. It's that very lengthy oil change interval that creates all this additional acids within the oil and eventually starts breaking down the papers within the filter itself. That is the biggest killer of a lot of engines. Of course, oil is critical, not just for lubrication of bottom end, rod bearings, valve train, VANOS solenoids, but it's also important even in your filter, they can start to deteriorate. You want to change them sooner than the recommended BMW oil change service intervals. The other bonus with that is It's actually a slightly revised version of the oil filter housing versus the N54 and the N55, which were guaranteed to leak. Now, one added bonus with the B58 upgraded oil filter housing was that hopefully it doesn't leak as much as the N54 or N55 units that you find typically under the hood here. I know on my N54, it was mounted right here, and the problem with it was there's two weirdly shaped gaskets. They were rubberized and they compressed down, but the problem with time and age and deterioration, they start to leak. There's no fixing that. You can either get oil, coolant leaking, or combination thereof. So you actually have some of it actually keeping oil from the engine, as well as there's an oil cooler that bolts up there too. So there's a couple of key gaskets that can leak. The B58, so far we'll see, it's revised. We're hoping that it's not a major leaker like you typically find in the N54 or N55. But time will tell. So the fourth problem with modern day B58 engines has to do with the VANOS solenoids. That's essentially your variable valve timing system. And that's what keeps everything in sync, keeps your fuel, air, and exhaust mixture all working just perfectly and in tune. Problem is, when those solenoids go, which only last about 100,000 miles, you can typically start to expect check engine lights, sloppy running condition. For example, it'll be hesitant and sloppy off the go. It may not want to run right. Excessive fuel consumption, a rough idle, and it might be up and down or surging and hunting. And it may even just outright go to limp mode and prevent you from driving properly down the road. Now, another one worth noting, of course, isn't necessarily in high numbers, so that's why it doesn't necessarily make the list of most common problems, but it is problematic when the B58 is equipped doubled up to the manual transmission. And we're talking about the crankshaft guide bearing. That is a known issue, and it's actually made the recall list. If it goes, which is relatively low probability, however, it can be catastrophic. So with the exception of some minor coolant leaks and some slight coolant consumption, the fact of the matter is there's far less issues related to the high pressure fuel pump or injectors themselves, certainly a lot less issues with turbos, wastegates, and overall at this point the B58, and it has been out for a few years now, is certainly looking far more reliable than even the N55 it replaced. And with all of that said, be sure to click right there. It's a great video of me personally and why I will never buy another BMW. Hope to see you real soon. Catch you then. Bye-bye.